When we discussed operant conditioning, we spoke about the law of effect, the way that animals tend to repeat behaviours that have good outcomes. The dog pees outside and gets a cookie, so the dog's going to pee outside more often. Well, animals and humans will often string together long chains of these reinforced behaviours until they can be performed effortlessly as a single behavioural sequence. If you've ever seen a dog pick up all its toys and put them away in a toy box, or seen a rat run a complicated maze to reach a tasty piece of cheese, then what you're witnessing is a long chain of simple behaviours that have been repeatedly performed one after the other over and over again until that whole behavioural sequence becomes second nature. Behavioural scientists call these highly practiced behavioural chains habits. Have you ever had the experience of driving to work and your mind wanders off and then you suddenly realise that you've arrived at your destination with no memory of how you got there? If so, then you've experienced the power of habits firsthand. You can very safely steer your vehicle, stop at traffic lights, indicate, change lanes and avoid obstacles, and have no conscious recollection of any of it. Habits are very, very powerful. But sometimes our mindless habits and our conscious goals are in opposition to each other. This is why you might accidentally drive to work when your goal was actually to drive to the doctor's office. And now you're late. To change from your really well-practiced, mindless but wrong habit, your prefrontal cortex needs to kick in and take control of your behaviour. Only when your prefrontal cortex takes control can you perform the less well-practiced, effortful but correct behaviour, driving to your doctor's office, not mindlessly driving to work on autopilot. Incidentally, this is the actual reason why Freudian slips happen. Anyway, in 2000, Anne Graybiel and her colleagues proposed that OCD was the result of dysfunctional habits and an inability of the prefrontal cortex to take control of the person's behaviour. Just like the accidentally driving to work instead of the doctor's example, OCD habits often run in opposition to the person's actual goals. Their goal may be to make a quick trip to the shops, but instead they spend half an hour locking and unlocking the front door. Remember that when our habits and our goals are in conflict with each other, the prefrontal cortex needs to kick in and drive the person's behaviour. But this doesn't happen in people with OCD. In fact, it doesn't happen in lots of disorders where compulsions play a big role, such as addiction, some eating disorders, and gambling disorder. As an aside, this is why talking about these disorders as a lack of willpower is really not very helpful. It wasn't exactly a lack of willpower that caused you to drive to work instead of the doctor's office, right? It was simply a conflict between your habits and your goals. One key part of behavioural chains is what's known as a cutoff point or end signal. This is where the brain recognises that the environmental stimuli match the way that they're supposed to look when the behavioural chain is finished. This is a pretty abstract concept to think about, so think about making a cup of tea. You do each of the subroutines like grasping the kettle and pouring water, grasping the milk jug and pouring the milk. You've reached for a spoon and stir, and once each of these subroutines has been performed, you take a look at your cup and your brain says, yep, that's right, all finished. Recognizing that your cup of tea looks the way it should signals your tea making habit's cutoff point. Your brain stops the tea making habit because the tea looks just right. A brain region known as the striatum plays a crucial role in signaling these cutoff points. Another part of the brain, the orbitofrontal cortex, plays a role in recognizing that the environmental stimuli look the way they should when the task has been completed correctly. Think about the way that your tea looks when you've added just the right amount of milk, and then thank your orbitofrontal cortex for giving you the signal that it's right. Sure enough, fMRI studies have repeatedly demonstrated that connections between the striatum and the orbitofrontal cortex is altered in people with OCD. And probably unsurprisingly, in OCD cases where the person needs to keep repeating the same ritual over and over again until it feels just right, neurons in the striatum don't fire when they're supposed to. They don't signal that habit cutoff point when they should. This is probably why people with OCD repeat those rituals over and over again, and they can't explain why the behaviour hasn't been done right. Another thing that happens during these repetitive rituals is that the person's brainwaves change in a very particular way. When you're performing a behaviour like making a cup of tea, and you suddenly realise that you've done something wrong, you put the sugar in the wrong cup, your brainwaves change. The brainwaves from a part of the brain called the anterior cingulate cortex dip ever so slightly. The technical term for this is error-related negativity. What's really interesting is that the error-related negativity dip is way bigger in OCD rituals that don't feel quite right. In fact, the OCD dips are bigger than those seen with repetitive behaviours of any other mental illness like schizophrenia, depression, anxiety, compulsive drug seeking, or autism. Because of this unique trait, it might make it a useful tool in early diagnosis and treatment, which we'll talk about more next time.